What if I told you that Moses and Paul have more in common than you might realize? I know Paul didn't split any great bodies of water, and Moses didn't write anything in Ephesians. But if you lay their stories kind of side by side, the Bible starts to tell you some pretty weird stuff. There's stuff about baskets and miraculous encounters, about revelation and hostile religious systems, and followers who complain and death threats. This could be a Netflix series. And if Moses and Paul had ever come together and had a chat with each other, they might have said, "Oh, did your people try to kill you too?" Well, welcome back to a really interesting little story. Just some housekeeping here for those of you. I often like to sit in this little hut that we have outside of our house, and I've got a picture here that's an old Dutch school picture that if you had gone to Dutch school maybe 50 or 60 years ago, you would have seen hanging in the classroom. And this is a preacher somewhere outside of the city of Utrecht, just so you know what's going on there. And if you've seen me in this shirt before, it's because my wife loves this shirt. So any of you guys out there know that if your wives love your shirts, that they want you to wear them. And she doesn't want me to wear the ratty old ones that I like. So anyway, that's the housekeeping out of the way. Paul and Moses. Now, I got this idea, like I got my idea for the questions that were asked of Jesus, and I'll show you a clip of that, or put that in the description and show it to you right here. I got that from listening to Randy White. And Randy White, in the middle of some sermon someplace, said, well, it would kind of be interesting to do a study one day about, the questions asked to Jesus. And I thought, ooh, I'll just take that. And so I did. And some really interesting stuff came out of it. I think the gist of it is that the questions might not be too surprising and who asked them and all that kind of stuff, but all of the questions were purely and alone focused on the kingdom. There was absolutely no question about grace. That's kind of what came out of that one, if you don't have time to go back and watch it. And then I was listening to David Reed. So two guys I really respect and like to listen to, and maybe you do too. And he was opining in the middle of a sermon and said, it'd be interesting to look at the commonalities between Moses and Paul. And I thought, I'll take that one too. So here we are. It's not going to be too long. There are some, and if you're like me, I could think of maybe 3. And there are more than that, but if we've woven them together here, and it should be a really interesting little study. So let's get on with it.
Oh, have you ever heard this?
So when it comes to Moses and Paul, you might first think about, there are a lot of differences. Moses belongs to Sinai and the law. Paul belongs to Damascus and grace. Paul stands before Pharaoh. Moses stands before Pharaoh. And Paul stands before Caesar. Well, that's pretty interesting. Moses brings the law, which could make you righteous, and Paul brings the mystery. And if you take a look, you start to see that the Bible paints these two men, if you will, with remarkably similar brushstrokes. And it begins in a strangely specific way that I never would have come up with. And that is, Moses is placed in a basket and then floated downriver in order to be saved from death, because you remember that all the boys were little boys, Jewish little boys were being killed by the Egyptians or by Pharaoh. And Paul escapes death by being lowered down in a basket. Exodus 2:3 says, she took him for an ark of bulrushes and put the child therein, and she laid it in the flags by the river's brink. Of course, Paul escapes as well by a basket. Acts 9:25 says, then the disciples took him by night and let him down the wall in a basket. And one enters this danger of the little river. He enters danger. Moses enters danger in order to live, and Paul is escaping danger in order to live. So I don't think I would have ever come up with that if I hadn't had a little bit of help. And once you see that, it's an echo that's, it's easy to see. And then you see that both men are very connected to the systems that help people oppose God. Moses is raised in Pharaoh's house. In Exodus 2:10, it said, and he became her son. This is the daughter of Pharaoh. And he became her son, and she called his name Moses. Paul, meanwhile, is trained under the authority of the Pharisees. And on top of that, he is a Roman citizen, to the Romans who actually crucified Christ. So Acts 22:3, he's brought up in the city at the feet of Gamaliel and taught according to the perfect manner of the law of the fathers. Now, that's not necessarily bad, but we know that it was the Pharisees and the Romans that got his Messiah crucified. And neither of these guys begin as the obvious hero. I think as I say that, you're probably thinking, oh yeah, that's right. In fact, both of them are kind of standing in tension with, God's intention. Moses kills an Egyptian that was beating on the Israelites. And then when he tries to intervene again, he's rejected by the people that he was kind of trying to help. Exodus 2:14 said, who made thee a prince and a judge over us? So you think you're doing the right thing, and it goes all wrong. Paul openly persecutes these believers in the gospel of God, or the gospel of Christ, this sort of extension of the kingdom gospel that he talks about in Galatians 1, the gospel that I once laid waste, or those kinds of words. In Acts 8:3, it says, as for Saul, he made havoc of the church, entering into every house, and hailing men and women committed them to prison. Hailing is dragging them off to death. Actually, it's the Dutch word to haal, to get, to go out and get something. So we see that in our Germanic languages even today, even though it's kind of an archaic word. But then comes the turning point. And for Moses, this is a remarkable burning bush. So in Exodus 3:2, the bush burned with fire, and the bush was not consumed. And for Paul, of course, it's the blinding light and the voice on the way to Damascus. Acts 9:3-4. Suddenly there shined round him a light from heaven, and he fell to the earth and heard a voice saying to him, Saul, Saul, why persecutest thou me? One encounter with God completely redirects these guys' lives. And after the encounter comes a commission. God says to Moses in Exodus 3:10, come now therefore, and I will send thee unto Pharaoh, that thou mayest bring forth my people. No pressure there. And regarding Paul, Acts 9:15, he is a chosen vessel unto me to bear my name before the Gentiles. Now that's Acts 9, and you know about all the stuff about, is it Acts 9, Acts 13, Acts 15, Acts 28, all that kind of stuff. And I think probably it's only in Acts 13 where they finally say, or where Paul finally says, in Acts 13:46, lo, we turn to the Gentiles. But of course, you know, in Greek, the Gentiles is ethnos, and so that could be the nations. And if you follow the way I look at this, and Randy White does as well, a good part of Paul's ministry and a good chunk of his letters is actually directed to Jews and actually expounding the Gospel of John, which is this Jesus is actually Christ and God gospel, which you would call the gospel of Christ or the gospel of God. This is what he refers to in Romans 1. So his commissioning, if you will, is a little more complex. He's got a double commission. One is, hey, you Jews, you can still get the kingdom, and Jesus is the Messiah and the King, and he'll come back. And then there's this one body, the mystery, where it's everybody, Jews and Gentiles. And you see, earlier on, he's focused more on the gospel of Christ, and later he's focused more on the mystery. Okay, so enough. That's a little bit of a rabbit hole, but I did want to make that clarification right there. And then God redirects both of their lives, and both men decide to emphasize their weaknesses. Oh no, I couldn't go off and do that. I've got flat feet. Well, they didn't quite say that. In Exodus 4:10, Moses says, I am not eloquent, but I am slow of speech. So he gets Aaron to do a lot of the talking for him. Paul writes in 1 Corinthians 2, verses 3 and 4, I was with you in weakness and in fear and in much trembling, and my speech and my preaching was not with enticing words of man's wisdom. So, and I don't talk that well, and, I just go out there and go, bleh, both of them seem to have had something along these lines. So neither of them is presented as naturally impressive. Well, Moses was a kind of prince of Egypt, and Paul was, had learned at the feet of Gamaliel, and he was a rising star there. But they don't compare to what they actually became. And Moses, of course, goes on to perform signs and wonders in front of Pharaoh. And while Paul is pushing this gospel of Christ, this extension of the kingdom gospel, the kingdom is still on offer, he is also accompanied by some signs and wonders. For example, in Romans 15, 18, and 19, through mighty signs and wonders by the power of the Spirit of God. And so both of these guys are accompanied by signs and wonders. However, that disappears for Paul once we get into anything to do with a mystery. And if this weren't enough sort of correspondence between these two guys for you, they were both really kind of opposed by their people. They got a lot of resistance. And for poor old Moses, there were all these complaints while they were in the wilderness. And so he was being led by this pillar of fire and a pillar of cloud and all this, and you've gotten manna from heaven, and people are like, "Oh, come on, we miss the onions from Egypt." Paul gets opposition as well. If we look in Acts 13:45, it says, "The Jews were filled with envy and spake against those things which were spoken by Paul." And of course, there's this group of guys who takes an oath, 40 guys who take an oath and say that they're going to kill Paul, or they're, going to starve to death or something like this. And, that creates another big problem there for poor old Paul. And both of them experience a kind of withdrawal period or a contemplative period. Moses goes out for 40 years in Midian and kind of gets on with his life, but he's being sort of shaped by God, you can imagine. And in Acts 7, verse 30, we see when the 40 years were expired, there appeared to him in the wilderness of Mount Sinai an angel. Okay, so Moses is being out there. And Paul says in Galatians 1:17, I went to Arabia and spent quite some time out there getting his thoughts together. Yeah, it gives the impression that they had to go through a period of isolation or a period of contemplation before they could fulfill this role that God had for both of them. And of course, both of them have probably the two major dispensations in the Bible. So through Moses, you get the covenant of the law, and the law could make you righteous, okay? And through Paul comes something completely different, and that is the mystery and the gospel of the grace of God. In Ephesians 3:3-5, it says, by revelation he made known unto me the mystery, which in other ages was not made known unto the sons of men. So both of these guys insisted that their message came straight from God. One on the top of a mountain with clouds and lightning and thunder, and one on the way to Damascus in this intense light and this thunderous voice. Paul writes in Galatians 1:11-12, the gospel which was preached of me is not after man, for I neither received it of man, neither was I taught it, but by the revelation of Jesus Christ. Neither merely inherits a tradition or a prophecy, both receive a revelation, something completely new. And both deliver written instruction, which is really good for us. So Moses delivers the Torah, and Paul writes his epistles to the churches, whether you believe there were 7 confirmed. I'm just going to go with 14. And one of those, of course, is Hebrews. And as we saw before, especially with the baskets and this kind of stuff, they're both got threats to their lives. Pharaoh looked to kill Moses. And Acts 9:23 says of Paul, the Jews took counsel to kill him. And intriguingly, neither man sees the final fulfillment that was associated with their ministry. Moses dies before entering the promised land. And Paul, who you might think, and I think the apostles too, expected that Jesus would be returning within their lifetimes. Well, he writes in 2 Timothy 4:6-7, for I am now ready to be offered. I have fought a good fight. I have finished my course. So my point is not here that Moses and Paul are identical. Law and grace, the Torah and the gospel of the grace of God, the epistles that Paul wrote, are not identical at all, even though you could say that the God is the same. So Moses governs under a covenant law. And Paul describes himself in 1 Timothy 2:7 as a preacher and an apostle, a teacher of the Gentiles. So he doesn't have this sort of higher commander kind of status of the people. But of course, Paul also says that he's chief among, sinners. And I think if you pull that verse apart, you see that he's not saying, I'm the most sinful guy out there, but I'm the guy that was first saved in this new way. So, they're getting out there. They're leading the way, but I do have the feeling that Moses was a little bit more of sort of the typical leader of the people than Paul. And the parallels are pretty striking. And of course, as I said before, both of them are standing at the beginning of the two most important dispensations that are in the Bible. And once you start looking at these textual echoes, well, you can't really unsee them anymore. And so after all of this, maybe the real lesson is, if you see a guy who is connected to a hostile religious system, escaping in a basket, wandering in the wilderness, arguing with his own people, getting a revelation from God, performing signs, writing scripture, and standing at the cusp of a new dispensation, well, you should probably start paying attention. At least good old Moses and Paul, I'll bet they have a lot to talk about, probably complaining people and assassination attempts. And until next time, I will say to you, God bless.